Once again, thanks for being here. Hopefully, from here on out, we'll be meeting. Of course, none of us expected this 3 months ago, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the autumn. But I hope everything is just going to move on. If you didn't see, like on the Facebook page, at least for now, we won't be doing the coffee and tea and that kind of thing, just kind of for sanitary purposes, so people feel safe and aren't drinking from cups so they don't know if they're always washed. But just we want people to feel safe. But if you want to bring food, no one is going to stop you and slap it out of your hand. So you're welcome to bring something, and if you don't feel safe taking it, that's okay. So like I wrote, maximum grace right now is we're all trying to figure out, how to do this together and hopefully get back to normal. And maybe by the autumn, everything will be back to normal in your life and in the church's life. Anyway, so when we started the Exodus series, we were not anticipating this, and we were only a couple weeks into our sermon series through Exodus when suddenly everything came to a halt quite quickly. I wasn't even in Latvia at that point, and so suddenly, the next Sunday I came back, I wasn't here. But I'm glad that we could get back face to face for our final Exodus sermon. So today, semi-historic, we're finishing up our series on Exodus, and mainly what I'm going to do is kind of give an overview of the book just to reinforce what's there. I'm actually ending this series the way we began. We're going to look at the same verse that we began with. And to me, it's interesting just what that idea is going to be, because we have experienced that truth in ways we didn't expect. When we started this, about the character of God and how God is involved in our lives in ways that are not necessarily easy to understand. And so I really hope that, what I'm going to talk about today will have greater meaning, because of what we experienced, because we've experienced, God in a special way, God's goodness to us. But I've been thinking about this idea that the timing is everything. You perhaps heard that line. Where you often hear it is with comedians. Comedians often talk about comedic timing, and when you're making a sitcom or something, timing is so important. And if you're one of those people who get on YouTube and listen to interviews, like of all your favorite characters on Friends or whatever, because I know some of you are into Friends, and so people talk about the importance of timing. Timing is everything. And the way I've kind of expressed this during this series is that we need to remember where we are in the story. I mean, even when we think about Exodus and some of the weird things that happen there, or that God does, you have to remember where we are in the story. God was doing certain things then for a particular purpose, because that's where the story was. But if we moved on in the story, some things might change. So we just have to remember where we are in the story. Some of the laws that were given back then don't apply to us anymore, okay? Because we're in a different place in the story. I mean, for instance, about not eating pork. Where would Latvians be if we didn't eat pork? Where would our carbonara go and our cutletas go? We need to eat pork. And so, if you're a meat eater in Latvia, you probably eat pork, even though they didn't then. But they were at a place in the story, we're at a different place in the story. Okay, and so timing is very important to understand what's going on really through the entire Bible, certainly when we think about the book of Exodus. The story starts with rescue. So the first 18 chapters of the book of Exodus, God, purely by grace, rescues his people. They had no means of rescuing themselves. They were not necessarily worthy of rescue, but God just steps into their story. They might be thinking he's stepping into the story a little bit late. That might have been their thought, but he steps into their story and he rescues them, and then God brings them into relationship with himself, and that was his purpose. It wasn't just to give freedom, but it was to bring them out of Egypt so he could bring them to himself, to have a relationship, and that's especially expressed first in Exodus chapter 19, and those are some others of the kind of critical verses in the book of Exodus, and God tells the people, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians. I mean, literally, the corpses floating on the water, to kind of give the harder way to picture that. The song that we sang, split the sea so we could walk right through it. The next part of the story, though, is the unjust enemy also received retribution. You saw what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings, and I brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice, keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So God brings the people into relationship with them. And this is why he has chosen them to have this relationship with them, and then so that they can have this role in the world. And it's in that context then that we come to the rules. And this is another example where timing is everything. Okay, and getting the timing of this in relationship to the entire book. The story does not start with rules. No one had to do anything first. No one had to obey first. No one had to measure up first. No one had to be worthy first. No one was worthy. No one measured up. No one kept any rules. They barely even knew God at that point. God rescues them, but then he gives the rules. And so they have a place and a necessary place, but it's very important all through the Bible where they fit. And you see this in the New Testament. You read Romans, rescue, then behavior. You read Ephesians, rescue, then behavior change. You read Colossians, the same thing. If you remember 1 Peter, it's the exact same pattern. God establishes his people and brings them into a relationship, and it's only in that context that the rules come. The rules are necessary, okay, but they're not first and they're not central. So timing is important. And then once again in the book of Exodus, we have so much more that's about relationship. And in the book of Exodus, remember, that's mainly about the tabernacle, the building of the tabernacle, and how much that fills the book. A number of chapters, this is what it's supposed to look like. And then a number of other chapters, almost the same details, actually doing it. A lot of repetition of just this kind of mundane building this building. Imagine if on Sunday morning I spend half the sermon, just describing this room. You'd think, what the heck are you doing, Mark? We see it, okay, just move on. That's not the important part. But it's all about relationship, because the tabernacle is where God was going to be present with his people. Okay, and it's about that relationship. And then all of that was about having a people who would represent God. And you see that explicitly in the verses that I just read in chapter 19, where you're to be a kingdom of priests. Okay, you will stand between me and the other nations. The story is about the other nations, and these chosen people are chosen to represent God, because God said, all the earth is mine. And we saw that in Psalm 67 that we just read. All peoples, all nations. And once again, here we are, all peoples and all nations, and I'll come back to it, thinking about what's going on in America right now. Me seeing you is an amazing experience. Here's this little picture of the kingdom of God, and you right now are representing God and God's goodness. Right now, right this second, your body is doing that in this room. And so God has the people to represent him, because the world needs to see that. Now, in the middle of this, something else happens. The last couple sermons that Tom's preached and then John preached was this hard incident in the middle of the story where there's this rebellion. And the people grow fearful because Moses has been on the mountain for 40 days and they're wondering what's going on, and they're okay, and they need to see a God. They're not yet used to this God that they cannot see, and so they want to build, they make this golden calf, and this is rebellion against God because, God has said already, no image like that. So there's this scene of rebellion. And then there's a kind of repentance, but then there's restoration. So once again, the timing here, especially about the tabernacle, where you have the tabernacle details given, and then you have all of this, especially in chapter 32, where it should be end of story. The Bible could have ended in Exodus chapter 32 in a sense. Or God could have just restarted the whole thing like he threatened to do. Okay, I'm just wiping out those people. I'm going to start again with Moses. But that doesn't happen. And so after that, once again, the tabernacle is built because God is going to be with his people. He's going to be present with his people. He will not reject his people. He will not abandon his people. He will live with them. They live in tents, and he's going to live in a tent in the midst of them. God will. Now, the first sermon that I preached from Exodus, I quoted this from Eugene Peterson. He passed away a year or two ago, or a couple of years ago at old age. He's one of those kind of few leaders who finish his story well, who is faithful and very obviously faithful to to everyone's sight, all the way to the end. A pastor, preacher, and a writer said Eugene Peterson's son Leif said at the funeral that his dad only had one sermon. They had everyone fooled for 29 years of pastoral ministry. That for all his books, he only had one message. There's a secret Leif said his dad had let him in on early in life. It was a message that Leif said his dad whispered in his heart for 50 years. Words he had snuck into his room to say over him as he slept as a child. God loves you. God is on your side. God is coming after you. He is relentless. And that's a decent enough summary of the book of Exodus. And it's the summary of the entire Bible. And one of the things I want us to get today is that the story of Exodus is really the story of the entire Bible. And although often people, I've wanted to say kind of the God of the New Testament is very different than the God of the Old Testament, if you just read and pay attention to the clues in the Bible, it's one story and it's one God. And he never changes. He never changes who he is. He never changes his plan. And from literally the first chapter of the Bible, this is the truth. The goodness of God, God loving people and blessing people, and he is relentless. And we talked about this highly dysfunctional relationship that God has with his people, mainly because his people are highly dysfunctional. They're a bunch of screw-ups. But he is relentless. And he pursues his story to the end, okay? And you can see that not just in individual words in Exodus, though they are there. Just in the entire story of Exodus, you can just see that. And so Exodus is giving this revelation of God, and all of this, including the order of events, reveals something about God, and even those rules reveal something about God. God is making himself known to people. In fact, one of the kind of the subtext of the book of Exodus is knowing God and who knows God and what are the consequences of not knowing God. And maybe you remember that the sermon from Exodus chapter 6, when Pharaoh very defiantly says, I don't know that God, I don't know his name. Because Moses has been giving this name, Yahweh, of their God. And Pharaoh's like, I don't know him, I don't know that name, that's a new name, I'm not going to do what he says. He says, I don't know him. He comes to know him. And it's not good news for Pharaoh. Pharaoh knows his name by the end of the story. It wasn't a wise move on Pharaoh's part to say, I don't know him. And so the story is people coming to know God and acknowledging God's name. So that's kind of where we've been through the book of Exodus. But thinking a little bit more, this is all, by the way, introduction. So we're going to have like a 20-minute introduction and a 10-minute sermon. I hope that's okay with you, because that's all I got this morning. But just beginning to think about how this relates to us and how the story of Exodus, is part of our story. One of the things we should see here that I think relates to us is that God knows where we are, and he's taking us on a journey. So the people are being asked to go on a journey, and it's going to be very scary for them, because they're going to think, we want to get out of Egypt because it's really bad there. They're going to start this journey, and they're going to realize, man, this journey has lots and lots of question marks. At least when we were slaves, we knew exactly what we were supposed to do and what we were going to eat tomorrow. Now we're on this new journey, and it's actually more scary than slavery was. But he's going to be with them, and that's one of the key points of this journey, is now God lives in a tent, because the tent can move, and as the people move, God moves with them. God is with them, and so his presence is going to be with them. But this is hard for us to consider our life on a journey. And one of our problems with this is that we don't know where we are on the journey. And we don't exactly know what the end is. And probably all of you, most of you are fairly young here. I'm glad we have lots of students here, and you have some kind of a plan. At least now you made a plan for an education, and you have hopes and expectations about what's coming next. Probably, I hope they're wise and good plans. I'm guessing that they are. And very possibly they will, come to fulfillment the way you picture it now. But more than likely, some of the things you picture about your future, it's not going to happen that way. And almost certainly, it's not going to happen according to your timing. We don't know exactly where we are in our story. And so we don't know where God is taking us and why he's doing certain things. And so a lot of things in our life are not going to make sense right now. Just like they didn't make sense to Moses. Moses, in a sense, experienced God in a way that few people do, but a lot of things did not make sense to Moses, not even to Moses or Abraham. And even if we want to take Jesus' words seriously when he prayed in the garden, maybe a moment in which suddenly, even for Jesus, things didn't seem to make sense. Because we're on this journey, and we're not at the end of this journey yet. We have to choose faithfulness. We have to choose to keep making these steps, that God knows where we're going, and he sees where we are now, and he's taking us a little bit further. One of the little pieces of good news is that we don't often know what's coming in the future, and that's probably good. Maybe we wish we kind of had the whole story laid out. If God would just tell me, if God told you what you might be facing in 10, 15 years, you might say, I'm not on that journey. I don't want to experience that. I say that seriously, because there's parts of my journey that if I knew ahead of time that's what I was going to experience, I wouldn't have signed up for the journey. I would have gotten off that road, seriously. And only afterwards can I say, that was actually good. I'm glad I didn't know what I was going to have to go through to get here, but it was actually good. And that's related to the second main point from Exodus, and that is God has a name, and He has a character, and He has a plan. So, the story kind of begins in Exodus chapter 3 with God introducing His name to Moses, or the meaning of His name, Yahweh. And that name is related to His character. I am who I am. And that name is related to His plan, because it's not just who God is all by Himself, but who He is in relationship to people. And so one way to paraphrase that name is, God is saying, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I've got a plan and I'm going to do it, and you can be sure I'm going to be faithful to that plan because it's wrapped up in my character and my name. And even last night, my name Sandberg was being used. What do Sandbergs do? There's certain things Sandbergs do, because it's like, we're on time, for instance. My whole family, we're just tend to be on-time kind of people. I can't help it. Sandbergs sleep badly. I get up 5:30 every morning. I don't want to. I want to sleep in. I can't sleep in because we just don't sleep well. We get up early. So I'm lying in bed like 5 in the morning. Seriously, I think I might as well just get up because it's who I am. And in a sense, I wish it were different, but it's who I am. And what God does is because of who He is, and we can know He's going to do the good things He has in mind because His name and His character is wrapped up in it. And so all of Exodus is revealing the name and the character of God. And once again, that's what we're going to end up with. What is the main thing that is being communicated about the character of God in the book of Exodus? But He's actually got a plan, and that's, of course, related to this journey that He's taking people on. Okay, because He actually has a plan and He knows where it's going, even when we don't. One of the characters in the story of Exodus that we haven't talked much about is Joshua. He's a young man. Young, he's probably at least 30 years old. But he's kind of Moses' personal servant. So he's gone up halfway up the mountain with Moses part of the time. But he's old enough to kind of be the general of the armies when they go out to fight. But he's just sort of Moses' helper. And I imagine what Joshua was thinking in the events in the book of Exodus is, this is a good deal. I get a role, I have something I can do, maybe I have gifts in this, but thank God there's Moses. And Moses has to take all the complaints. He's got to do all that stuff. And we're going to get to the border of the promised land, and Moses is going to lead us into the promised land. And he's going to be our leader. Moses will establish us. And I can just keep having my role of being Moses' helper. Poor Joshua has no idea that God is not going to let Moses go into the promised land. Joshua is going to have to do that. If he knew that now, are you kidding me? Without Moses, I'm not leading those people. I can't defeat those nations. Who am I? I'm sure if Joshua knew that, he would have been, someone else. There's a lot of other men in Israel. They can take that job, not me. But God had a plan for Joshua that Joshua didn't see. And so Joshua was on that journey, and step by step, there he was, kind of stuck in it. Kind of a story about Communitas and its roots. There was a previous international church that it's not exactly us, but we kind of developed out of that, and I was involved in that for a number of years. In the earlier years of that particular international church here in Riga, I was more or less assistant pastor. I was doing other things, teaching, and I was completely and utterly satisfied kind of being an assistant pastor, and I had no desire to kind of become the main pastor of that church, and I would have felt completely unqualified to do that. But suddenly, in the course of like 6 months, all the other leaders, no exaggeration, left Latvia. And I was stuck. I really felt stuck because I desperately did not want that role. I truly felt completely and utterly unqualified. And I wasn't qualified. I, in truth, was not qualified. God was not concerned about my qualifications, unfortunately. And so the next 18 months were pretty much the hardest of my life. I mean, I was pretty much in desperation for 18 months or more of my life at that point. Anyway, things went on, and God was not listening to me at that point. And I wasn't qualified, and I don't think things went all that well. But what I think now is that God had something in mind, including this. Okay? Including what we're experiencing right now here. And I think if I hadn't gone through that, I honestly, I still don't feel so qualified for what I'm doing here. But now it's like, it doesn't matter if I'm qualified or not, let's just go for it. You know, that's maybe the lesson that I've learned. But I don't think this could have been, you know, if God hadn't, I mean, God could have found someone else, no doubt. But I couldn't be doing what I'm doing now if it hadn't been for that experience. Okay, God had a plan, a long-term plan, and I don't even know what the future of this is going to be. I'm sure it's going to involve some other people. I mean, I'm not expecting to be like 80 years old up here in front of you. I'm expecting things to move on, and God, you know, so I don't even know what the future is. All I'm saying is what is happening now, I think, is part of a plan, and there were things that happened previously that didn't make sense to me, but God had a name and a character and a plan, and if you endure the timing, you can say it's good. It's actually a good thing. And then there's a better way of living, and God reveals it. And so the laws are not just arbitrary laws, but what God is trying to communicate is that, you know, there's an alternative lifestyle that might actually be better. And one of the ways that which people have kind of seen this recently, and you can see memes on Facebook about it, is, you know, suddenly those laws in Leviticus about washing your hands and that kind of thing, they make a lot of sense. You know, now suddenly a lot of people, you know, the World Health Organization, you know, several thousand years late, is kind of telling us to do what the law of Moses told us a long time ago. Why don't you wash your hands a little bit? Think of sanitation. You know, if you're sick, stay in your tent and that kind of thing. You know, God pretty much knew what he was doing a long time ago. And so this is what we see going on in this story. All right, so that's the introduction. That's kind of a review of the book of Exodus in case you have forgotten it. You know, because I imagine some of you, you know, on Sunday morning you turned on, you know, Facebook and you had the live stream going or whatever. But then, let's face it, you went to the kitchen, you got some coffee, you know, you went to the toilet. So you didn't listen to all the sermons, okay? I'm guessing. So we need to have this review. But now back to kind of the main point that's actually related to everything that I've said. And it's looking again now for the third time in Exodus 33 and 34. Okay, those are the same chapters that John looked at last week if you were listening to the record of his sermon, and it's the same passage we're going to end with that we began with. And in Exodus chapter 33, because of the people's rebellion, and even though God has forgiven them, God now is threatening to say, okay, but I'm not going with you. I'm going to send an angel, and my angel is going to be with you. But I'm not, you know, I've had it, you know, there's an American expression, I've had it up to here with you, you know, with your kids, and you just don't have any more patience with your kids. And so God is about there, I've had it up to here with you, and one more little thing, and that's it. And so God kind of threatens that, okay, I'm not going with you. I'll make sure you get into the promised land, I'll send an angel, but I'm going to keep distance. And here finally the people get wise, and they realize that cannot be. We've got to have God's presence. And Moses is begging God, don't send me, especially Moses thinking, don't send me if you're not going with me. You know, I'm not much happier with these people than you are. We've got to have your presence. So that's in Exodus chapter 33. And in verse 7, It says, now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp. This is a different tent than the tabernacle at this point. A distance from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. Everyone who sought the Lord would go to this tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. And Moses would go there to meet with God, and people would rise up and see him go there. And when Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend, and that's where Moses would meet with God and hear whatever it is, God had for Moses. So it says, the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face. Don't think physically. Okay, that's just an expression to say very, very personally, God is speaking to Moses. God doesn't have a body, doesn't have a face. It's an expression about the intimacy of their conversation. So Moses said to the Lord, look, you say to me, bring up this people, but you yourself have not let me know whom you will send with me. Moreover, you have said, I have known you by name. God said to Moses, I've known you by name. And you have found favor in my sight. Now, therefore, I pray you, if I have found favor in your sight, let me know your ways, that I may know you, so that I may find favor in your sight. Consider, too, that this nation is your people. Partially what Moses is doing there is like, don't give those people to me. Those are your people, God, okay? You've rescued them, and you've got to stay involved in them. You don't abandon me with those people. I don't want that job either. If I have found favor in your sight, let me know your ways that I may know you, so that I might find favor in your sight. This nation is your people. And he said, God said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Then he said to him, if your presence does not go with us, don't lead us up from here. For how can it be known that I found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not by your going with us that I and your people, may be distinguished from all the other people? They need to represent God, and Moses reminding God that these people represent you, and that's one of the reasons you've got to go with us. The Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing of which you have spoken, for you have found favor in my sight, and I have known you by name. Then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. And God said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before you, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, will show compassion on whom I will show compassion. Moses says, let me know your ways that I may know you. And I kind of take this as the central prayer of Moses, and maybe the central prayer of God's people, maybe the central prayer of all people who have ever existed. This is an expression of the longing of Moses' heart. And so I just want us to think a little bit about, what are we longing for? What are you longing for? What is it that you most want? I mean, all of us want a lot of things, but I think generally beyond the things that we think we want, an education, a job, a spouse, or kids if you want kids, or no kids if you don't want kids, respect or whatever it might be. There's lots of things that we want. But beyond all that, what is it that we are longing for? What is the bottom line that you must have? I think the longing of human hearts is actually expressed by Moses. Let me know your ways that I may know you. And most people are, through history, might not be thinking exactly about one personal God. But basically, all peoples everywhere at all times have had some kind of religion. They've had a sense that there's something greater than themselves, and they desperately want to get in touch with it. Whatever is out there, they want to know it who it is or what it is and how it works and how it can work for them. So everyone is religious. People, again, billions of people have existed on the face of the earth, and pretty much all of them are religious. They want something. Something in their heart is looking for what is out there. And you can study all sorts of different cultures, and all of them have practices and beliefs that are related to knowing what kind of God or gods are there, or how does nature work. How can I make nature work for me? Or how can I make the spirits work for me? How can I get in touch with God? Is God okay with me? Is there a God? What is God going to do with me? And once again, I don't think you can find any exception anywhere in any culture. As far as what I've read, I don't know of any culture, place, or time where people haven't had some kind of belief about who's out there. And of course now, especially in maybe secular Europe, there are people who deny any kind of God, and so this is a great hall of science here. There's a film, a comedy film, where there's a line, and my family quotes it, someone says, "I don't believe in God, I believe in science." It's a God. It's the same longing. People want to know how the world works. And they think, no, science will answer that. And then we can use science for our benefit. It's a God. It's a longing of their heart. They're trying to figure out how the world works. And they worship it as surely as anyone else has ever worshiped any other God. Because this is the longing of the heart. I think of all humanity. Let me know you. Let me know your ways. I need to know that. How can I live in this world if I don't even know how this world works? If there's nothing out there, this world is crushing me. This is a piece of a poem from an English poet from about 150 years ago, and I can't remember now where it came up a couple months ago. I don't know if it came up on Facebook or wherever I saw it, but I thought this was very, very timely, especially when we sort of entered into this whole period with the virus. He says, "For we are like swimmers in the sea." Now you should be thinking about one of the sermons, at sea without a map, the significance of the Red Sea and crossing the sea, and that image of chaos and disorder. We're like swimmers in the sea, poised on top of a huge wave of fate, which hangs uncertain to which side to fall, whether it will heave us up to land or whether it will roll us out to sea. That's 2 months ago. I mean, when we entered into this, we had no idea. Most of us thought, am I going to get this virus? And what will it be like? Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to have to leave Latvia? I mean, we had no idea. Will we meet again? When will we meet again? How will we meet again? Who will be here? This was a huge question mark. And people were making all sorts of predictions about this and that, and no one had a clue. I mean, the only reason I wasn't in despair then is I'm like, I don't have a clue, but the good news is no one else has a clue. No one knows what's going on. And no one can tell me you're doing it wrong, Mark, because they don't have a clue either. They didn't have any reason to think I was wrong or right because we were all clueless, seriously, 2 months ago. This same poet, in his kind of more famous poem, maybe his most famous poem, Matthew Arnold, if there's any of you who study English literature, I'm assuming there's no one else out there who does. But this is the end of one of his poems. I know you're thinking, I didn't come back to church, to have poetry quoted from some dead white guy, But my point of this is he's putting into words what we actually feel and think. And he's putting into words how most people experience life, especially when they're all alone in the dark. Our love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. And man, that last line, I think about, and sorry for this image, what's going on in America now, and all I can think is struggle and flight where ignorant armies clash by night. If this doesn't describe right now, I don't know what does. It was written 150 years ago. Nothing has changed. We all experience the world the same way, and we're all looking for something, and Matthew Arnold couldn't find it. He felt like faith was no longer possible. In his kind of situation, he felt we can't believe in miracles anymore. He wrote books about the Bible, but basically saying no more miracles, and he had some vague idea of a God that he hoped would bring greater morality. He was wrong. And the best he can do here, because this is cast in a love poem to his wife, let us be true to one another. And I kind of want to say good luck with that. Okay? This is kind of where we are and how we experience life. And so once again, what are we longing for, and is there anything out there? Is there an answer to this longing? Let me know your ways that I may know you. So Moses expresses the cry of his heart, and in Exodus chapter 34, God responds. The Lord descended in a cloud and stood there with him as he called upon the name of the Lord. Then the Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the grandchildren, to the third and fourth generations. We looked at those last verses previously. There's several ways, different ways where those might be interpreted, but for today, I just want to remind you of that contrast, third or fourth generations contrasted with 1,000 generations. Okay, and that's communicating, that's revealing something about the heart of God. Loving kindness to thousands of generations. The Lord descended in a cloud and stood there with him. The Lord stood there with him. The Lord stood there with him. And so he passed by in front of Moses. And this is God's own creed. This is God answering the longing of our heart. And it's so very, very important that we get that right here, these are God's words. This is what God says about himself. This isn't a human wanting this kind of God. This is what God says about himself. And that verse, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. If you recall when we looked about this before, this is the first of 8 times those 4 things are put together in one verse. All throughout the Old Testament, all throughout Old Testament history and all the different kinds of literature in the Old Testament, whether law or prophets or poetry or history, it's the same thing that is communicated. This is the story of the Old Testament, not just the New Testament. But again, right now, this is what God says about himself. This is the starting point. This is who God is at heart. And we have to know God first in this way. Compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth. And all through the history of God's people and of the church. People have created different kinds of creeds or statements of faith. Early ones, the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. We have occasionally recited those in church. Later ones, the Heidelberg Confession, the Westminster Confession, and there's all sorts of different sort of statements of faith that Christians have made. And generally, those can be helpful things, a nice kind of summary, to what are the most important things we need to remember about God and so forth. But I'm never quite sure why we can't just start with God's words. I don't know why. That can't be the beginning of our creed, because that's the beginning of God's creed. It starts right there. And it's so important that we start there, and everything that we understand about God revolves around that. And, you're very aware by now of, there's lots of different things Christians believe, and different churches have the kind of this emphasis, and sometimes they seem very, very different. And equally good and smart people sometimes understand God in ways that seem very, very different. And often that difference comes from where they start. They all look at the Bible, but as you're trying to put it together, the question is, where do you start? What is the center? What is the foundation? And everything is going to make a difference where you start. What is your controlling idea for everything else? And I don't know why there's a question about where you start, because it sure seems like this is it. This is where we start. And everything else we understand about God has to start here. How we understand the sovereignty of God, it needs to start here. How we understand the justice of God, it needs to start here. How we understand anything about God, this is the controlling idea. And if any belief that you have doesn't somehow follow from this, probably you've gotten something wrong if you're starting here. Because this is God's starting point. This is God's words. This is what God says about himself. Moses says, "Let me know you so I can know your ways." And God says, "Compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness." That's the answer to the longing of your heart. If that's the kind of God you want, that's the kind of God you have. But if that's the kind of God who is, so that's the kind of God you have. If you want a different kind of God that smashes everyone, okay, but this is the God who created the universe. Okay. That's the story of Exodus as a whole. It's a story of the Bible as a whole. It starts in Genesis chapter 1. God blesses, God, this powerful sovereign God, he is bent toward blessing because this is who he is. And the story ends the same way. The entire story is all about this, and this just puts into words what the entire story is about. Now, I understand, experientially that, we say that, but it's often hard to believe that. I mean, these are days when it's sometimes hard to believe this. And I don't really have a good answer to that, because I know that people often experience the absence of God, and it's sometimes hard to hear God's voice. And I don't have some formula of if you just follow these steps, God is going to speak to you, you're going to have this kind of experience. That's not the way the journey works. Sometimes on the journey, God appears to be absent, which is all the more reason we need to fix our minds on these truths. We need to remind ourselves of this. We need to burn this into our minds. We need to remind ourselves this is God's word. This is what God says about himself. And I don't feel this right now. But I'm not going to doubt this. I'm not going to organize my life by something else, because that's not going to work. But again, to me, when I thought about, I preached on those words the first sermon, having no clue what was coming down the road the next few months. That might have been the last sermon I preached here face to face, but when I preached that, I had no idea that I wasn't going to see most of your faces till today. But I see your faces today. There you are. And here I am. Maybe you didn't necessarily want to see my face, but you came. Okay, you probably knew I was going to be probably preaching way too long. Okay, and here you are and you came. It's because He's compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth. So as a matter of fact, we've experienced that. We have seen this truth, maybe in a small way, but we've seen it. We've actually seen it. Right this second, we're experiencing that is true. It is true. And it's actually possible to see signs of that. I want to end with this blessing. Some of you might have seen on YouTube a lot of different nations have done a musical version of this, and you can see the things where different people, and they all put it together, everyone in their own home, singing a version of Aaron's blessing from the book of Numbers. In many different languages. I almost thought about trying to get one, showing one of those here. I just wasn't sure exactly which language to use, and unfortunately all the English language ones I didn't like too much. So anyway, in any case, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance on you and give you peace. Have a great week. God willing, see you next week.